right, good evening. We are now live streaming on YouTube and on Facebook, and I call the August 4th, 2020 regular meeting of the City Council to order. We're going to go ahead and begin tonight's meeting with an invocation by Councilman Hermes, please.
Thank you. Heavenly Father, thank you for fellowship and family. We come to you today asking for guidance, wisdom, and grace. Strengthen us, restore us, enlighten us, and inspire us to do your will, not ours. As we journey onward, allow us to pour out your love and grace to others. Fill us with your spirit that we may take your promises into our community of Erlanger. Amen.
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 Okay. Go ahead and make sure that we are all muted in order to do the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, you should see the American flag on your screen. Rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you. All right, now we'll go ahead and call roll. Mrs. Hoffman, if you'd like to do the honors, please.
Mr. Cahill.
Present.
Miss Kyle.
Here.
Mr. Skidmore.
Here. Can you
Miss
hear me?
Yes. Miss
Okay.
Miss Cahill.
Here.
Mr. Meyer.
Here.
Miss Skidmore.
Here.
Miss Pitts. Mr. Nicely.
I'm here.
Miss Reckers.
I'm here.
Mr. Hermes.
Here.
Mr. Blankenship.
Here.
Thank you, Ms. Hoffman. All right, so you've all received a copy of the meeting minutes from last month's meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to be made at this time? Okay, seeing none, I'll entertain a motion that we adopt the meeting. Okay, Mr. Hermes, Mr.
Second.
Cahill. Okay, all in favor say aye.
I'm sorry. I had something that I wanted to make sure we had on the agenda this evening was to discuss the properties on Bartlett.
Well, this is for the meeting minutes.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry.
It's okay. You still want to be the first?
Sure.
Okay. Tom, you good with being the second? Cool. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye.
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 Okay, opposed? All right. Motion carries. All right. So now you all have received the agenda. I know that Mr. Hermes has talked about the closing of the right of way that you wanted to add to the agenda that Mr. Kramer had sent out on July 17th to the council.
Yes, regarding the email that Mr. Kramer sent out.
And Mr. Gatlin, was that going to require legislation, or was that just a voice
Yes.
vote from council?
No. So for us actually to do it, it will require an ordinance that needs to be passed.
Okay.
And I think the discussion that Mr. Kramer was wanting tonight was just to make sure council was on board with the idea before we engaged Vioxx Engineering into doing the survey work and some of the other costs that would be associated with that.
Okay. So we can go ahead and add that onto the agenda. We'll talk about it right after we approve the agenda. How about that? Does that work, Mr. Gatlin?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Are there any other changes or additions to be made to the agenda at this time? Okay. Do I have a motion that we adopt as presented with the additional discussion? Okay, Mrs. Reckers, Mrs. Kyle. Any other discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, motion carried. So Mr. Kramer, we'll just open it up real quick for you to talk a little bit about the right-of-way. And we'll kind of discuss how council feels about it.
Okay, thank you. So this was a request from, it started off with a request from one of the adjacent landowners. So in past, what we have done is split the property into two. If we have closed a right of way, staff took a look at the property and there was no use for that right of way anymore. There's a small alleyway. If you want to call it an alleyway, it's really just probably a 6 to 8 foot gap between some properties in that area. If this property here is, the right of way is closed, they'll still have access to the north and south of that alleyway if that was ever needed. I don't think it ever will be, but just in case anyone noticed that, we'll still have access to that. We've already contacted both homeowners. They both agreed to cover all the surveys and everything is needed legally to document the properties. At this point, all we need is a go-ahead from council to spend the money to cover it. And once the ordinance is passed and we can finalize it, we have a contract from both property owners that they'll cover all the costs that the city incurs.
Mr. Kramer, I just a question, and I was trying to look back at the email to see if it was in there, and I didn't see it. But if we, is it with the parcel size that's there, is it something that could be surplused and an independent home built on it?
It probably could. Right now, it's occupying 2 driveways, but to your point, we could, I guess, auction it off or surplus it and put it to a sealed bid. Like I said, typically in the past when we've done this and to close the right of way, we've split it in half and had both homeowners, if they were interested in the property, to take it over. They're currently in this lot. They're currently using it as a driveway, like a lot of other areas like that around the town. Tyson, do you have a question?
I thought I heard you say that you thought it was big enough for a house. I don't think it would be. It's a right of way. It's one driveway shared by 2 houses. There's no way you could build a house on that. It's all together like what, 10 or 12 feet wide?
Give me 1 second here. I think it's a little larger than that. It's 0.17 acres.
Oh,
Put it on your screen.
it's bigger than I had thought.
Yeah, I think it's a 50 foot. Give me 1 second here. Yeah, it's about 50 foot wide. So I mean, if we paid for the survey and then did a silent bid, we could get rid of it that way. But then we kind of had to deal with the 2 driveways that are there.
Yeah, both of those houses would lose access to their garages.
Correct.
And just from a legal perspective, anytime a city closes a right-of-way, there is a procedure in place. And we have to give notice to the adjoining property owners. And in this current situation, since we're giving them the property or proposing giving them the property, they're consenting to it. But if they did not consent to it, we would have to file an action in circuit court
Okay.
and kind of jump through some hoops to then close it.
So that sounds like it might be a little more expensive than just having them cover the cost of the.
And it might not happen. I mean, they would argue that they need the access for their driveways, and I'm not
Okay.
confident that the circuit court would grant it in our situation, especially when our only reason for not agreeing to the consent was, if we're wanting to surplus it.
Is there any other discussion on this matter? Matt, do you want to do a straw poll or some kind of voice vote?
Yeah.
But
Matt, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I really just wanted to know, make sure we don't have a majority that's against it right now to move forward. The cost is probably between $1,300 and $1,500. Again, the residents have agreed to pay that, assuming that council votes to close it and split the property as we talked. So that's the only, we can do a straw poll either way of who's in favor or who's against it.
Mr. Meyer?
no, I was just going to make a motion that we proceed with the disposing of that property as planned and closing that right away.
Mr. Hermes, are you seconding or do you have a
I'd
question?
second. Yes.
Okay. Any other discussion? Sherry, would you like to do a roll call? Please.
Ms. Sudcamp? No, she's not on. Mr. Cahill?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Skidmore?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that Miss Skidmore?
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Kyle?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Blankenship?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Nicely?
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Cahill?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Reckers?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hermes?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Skidmore?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mrs. Hoffman. All right, Matt, so you are good to go. Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome. All right, so let's go move on to the legislation piece of our agenda tonight. We're just going to keep it short and simple. Appreciate y'all getting back on Zoom. I know we've kind of gone back and forth on what we're doing here in Erlanger, but you know what? That's what everybody's doing. It's a little wild world we're living in right now. So Mr. Gatlin, if you'd like to go ahead and start off with some legislation.
Sure, Mayor. The first is an ordinance amending the Erlanger zoning ordinance, adding outdoor seating regulations for taverns and restaurants within the commercial and business park zones and amending the regulations for home occupations. Again, in summary, we already passed this back in December 3rd, 2020, based upon the recommendation of PDS and the Kenton County Planning Commission. But what we failed to do when we passed this ordinance in December 3rd was to add some of the changes that KCPC had made at their hearing, and there was a bit of a clerical error. So all we're doing is amending the ordinance that we passed in December to comport with the ordinance that we were really supposed to pass back in December. So there's no practical changes to any of this, and this is a second reading.
Okay, do I entertain a motion that we adopt this ordinance as read? Mrs. Kyle, Mr. Meyer, any discussion? Okay, seeing none. Mrs. Hoffman, can you do a roll call vote, please?
Mr. Skidmore,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hermes,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Reckers,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Meyer,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Cahill,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Nicely,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Blankenship,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Kyle,
Yes, ma'am.
Moore, Miss
What did you say?
Miss Skidmore,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Cahill.
Yes, ma'am.
That's everyone.
All right, next we have an ordinance of the city of Erlanger in Kenton County, Kentucky, updating the pay scale for all Erlanger employees and non-elected officers and amending the title of finance clerk. This is an annual ordinance that we passed. The only changes have been, you can see what has been struck through. There's been a little bit of a change in title to the police assistant, or we've removed the director of tech and innovation and removed the finance clerk, added an accountant. Also have made a cost of living adjustment for the minimum and maximum pays. This also is the second reading.
Do I entertain a motion that we adopt this ordinance as read? Mrs. Reckers and Mrs. Kyle, any discussion?
Yeah, yes, Mayor, this is Gary. The first reading did not include the minimum and maximum changes for cost of living. It was just the titles.
Was that a question, Gary, or are you making?
No, I'm making I guess a statement there. That seems to be a substantial change over if we are including the minimum and maximum changes according to cost of living in this ordinance versus the first reading that was read. That was one of the changes that we had pulled out during that first reading is just the changes to the titles.
I don't recall what we read the first reading. I'll take your word for it that we did not include the cost of living adjustments. I would argue that we discussed those and that it would not be a substantive change so that we can move forward with the second reading. It's given notice. We've given notice to people, and I think that's in spirit what would be necessary for a substantive versus a non-substantive change. I think if we added a position, Gary, and changed beyond COLA, I would agree it probably would be a substantive change.
But we're essentially changing every item. We're changing 100% of the entire attachment versus just, that seems to be fairly significant.
And it certainly would be within council's prerogative to table this as a second reading, and we can move forward with this as a first reading. I mean, that's certainly within the purview of council.
Just to point out also, Gary, there's an ordinance that states we will change the minimums per COLA every year. Unless we change that. I mean, we can change that, but there's a current ordinance right now that says every July that we will update the minimums by COLA. And then it actually specifies the amount of the max.
Matt, what ordinance, what section is that? I'm going to make the motion that we table. Yeah, I'm going to make a motion that we table this ordinance.
We have a motion on the floor to table the second reading. Do I have a second?
Is there any timing that is imperative that we're trying to hit here? Is it going to hurt us to delay this a month?
Jack.
I think that's really more of an administrative question. There's no legal reason delaying this a month really matters. The statute contemplates that you do it annually. Generally, it's done about the time of budget, but there's no requirement of whether we do it this month or next month.
Matt, it doesn't negatively impact anybody's pay. So, I mean, administratively, it probably doesn't matter whether we wait a month or not.
Now, if we hire anybody, I can still pay them the COLA minimums that are in
well,
the
that-
ordinance and not have to
and that-
follow them.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the discussion was, you know, it didn't make sense to pay someone that's just getting hired the same amount that someone's been working for a year. I mean, that was the reason that we kind of pulled those pieces out, because we were going to come back. I thought the discussion was we would start to look at that on a, not necessarily adjusting the pay scales to COLA every year, but actually, you know, you still have the ability to give raises within that period. And every so often, you know, 3 to 5 years, come back and look at, you know, does it make sense to adjust the pay scale itself?
And I agree with you, Gary. I just think it requires an ordinance change. If what Matt is saying is accurate, that means there's an ordinance that's requiring us to update it.
And I don't think that there is. You know, without actually you know, having that ordinance to be, you know, shared with us. I do feel this is kind of, you know, we were presented with one thing at a first reading, and now all of a sudden it's something completely different at the second reading.
Okay. So we have a motion on the table or a motion on the floor to table the second reading. Do I have a second? Okay, Mr. Hermes. Any other discussion?
So we're tabling it as a second reading and we're making it a first reading. Is that what I understand?
Well, we have to vote on whether or not you all accept to table it as a second reading. So that would, if you then vote for it to be tabled, then it would be read as a first reading.
It could be.
Yeah,
Good.
right now, I think we're just taking it off. The motion is to table it and to remove the second reading. I think there would have to be an additional motion made by council to add it back on as a first reading. But if there's no motion made, it's not going to be a first reading.
Mrs. Kyle, you have a question?
Yes, I don't see any sense in tabling it. I agree with Matt. I think we just need to go ahead and have the second reading. Just my opinion.
Okay, well, we have a first and a second, so we'll need to do, I guess we'll do a roll call vote for the tabling. Please, Mrs. Hoffman.
Miss Skidmore,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Kyle,
No, ma'am.
Mr. Blankenship,
No, ma'am.
Mr. Nicely,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Cahill,
No, ma'am.
Mr. Meyer,
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Reckers,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hermes,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Skidmore,
No, ma'am.
Mr. Cahill.
Yes, ma'am.
That was 6 yeses to table.
Okay, so this item will be tabled. The second reading will be tabled. So Mr. Gatlin, you're saying that if somebody wants to put it back onto the agenda as a first reading, we can do so.
Yeah, that would be correct.
Mrs. Reckers?
Motion to put it on as a first reading.
Okay. Mr. Hermes? Are
I
you-
wasn't seconding. I was going to mention something else.
Okay,
I'm seconding Mr. Cahill.
okay. We have a motion by Mrs. Reckers, a second by Mr. Cahill to add this item as a first reading. Mr. Hermes, do you have a question? You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to discuss something really quickly. Mr. Meyer, do you think it's possible that when you get the information that you're looking for, that you would agree that this could have we could go forward with a second reading? Or are you pretty sure that we would not go forward with a second reading?
Well, I guess my question on it was, I guess I challenged in principle that we're kind of being thrown this at the last minute when council hasn't, that the council was not involved in the discussion to make the change from the first to the second reading. To me, that's kind of, it feels, whether it was unintentional or not, to me it feels sneaky that we're just trying to slide something past council at the last moment. We can have discussion about it. That was the idea, is that we were going to have additional discussion in the future about whether it made sense to even continue to index every year as a cost of living.
Okay, and so just to clarify then too, would the first reading be tonight?
Yeah, well, we have a
That's the motion.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Any other discussion before we do a roll call vote to add it to the agenda? Okay. So what we're voting on is to add the first reading onto the agenda. Mrs. Hoffman, would you do the honors, please?
Mr. Hermes,
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Reckers,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Meyer,
No, ma'am.
Ms. Cahill,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Nicely,
No, ma'am.
Mr. Blankenship,
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Kyle,
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Skidmore,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Cahill,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Skidmore.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so Mr. Gatlin, do you need to redo that as a
Yeah,
first?
I guess just for clarification of the record, I'll go ahead and read that again. So that would be an ordinance of the city of Erlanger and Kenton County, Kentucky, updating the pay scale for all Erlanger employees and non-elected officers and amending the title of finance clerk, changing the title of finance clerk to accountant. And also within this first reading, it is doing a cost of living adjustment to each pay band.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Hoffman, can you note that the first reading has been read? All right, Mr. Gatlin.
Next, we have an ordinance of the city of Erlanger, Kentucky, amending the Houston Road, Erlanger Road development area previously established by city ordinance number 2457, renaming the development area as the Erlanger Commerce Center development area, reducing the boundaries of the development area, making certain findings related to the development area, and approving the execution of an amended and restated local participation agreement related to the development area. In summary, we are actually reducing the size of the TIF district. We discussed this matter with Jim Parsons, who helped us with the original creation of the TIF district, who also is representing the developer, primarily because of the success of the current TIF district and kind of what it looks like it's going to continue to develop out there. It was the recommendation of Mr. Parsons that we go ahead and reduce the TIF district. This is a second reading.
All right, do I entertain a motion that we adopt this ordinance as read? Mrs. Kyle? Do I have a second? Mrs. Reckers? Any other discussion? Okay, a roll call vote, please, Mrs. Hoffman.
Ms. Kyle,
They're gonna call your name.
Yes, ma'am.
What am I voting on?
10th district reduction.
Mr. Blankenship,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Nicely,
Say yes, ma'am. Right now, say it.
Yeah. Yes.
Ms. Cahill,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Meyer,
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Reckers,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hermes,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Skidmore,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Cahill,
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Skidmore.
Yes, ma'am.
All righty. Next, we have an ordinance of the city of Erlanger and Kenton County, Kentucky, approving and adopting a supplement to the Code of Ordinances of the city. This is an annual housekeeping ordinance. Basically, what's happening here is all the ordinance we've passed since the last supplement to the Code of Ordinances, which would be ordinances 2481 through 2487, are supplemented and added to our Code of Ordinances, which is what's found online with American Legal. This is just a first reading.
Mrs. Hoffman, can you note that the first reading has been taken care of, please?
All right, last but not least, we have a municipal order of the City of Erlanger and Kenton County, Kentucky, authorizing a request for bids for the award of a 10-year non-exclusive franchise from the city for the use of the public streets, alleys, and other public grounds in the city for the transmission and distribution of either or both natural gas and electricity through and for the consumption within the city. I'll let Mr. Kramer kind of take it from here. This is just the municipal order, which is going to allow the RFP for bids. But as we all know, there are only two providers, Duke and Owen Electric. And we already have somewhat pre-negotiated the franchise agreement with both entities. So Mr. Kramer, do you want to add anything on this?
I sent out the agreement that we worked with both Owen and Duke for, that they've agreed to, just so council could see the changes. Once this goes out to bid, and we've had a question that, are we able to renegotiate? And the answer is yes. So after we go out to bid, once we receive bids, council still have a chance to look at the franchise and make any adjustments they prefer. And then Duke and Owen will have a chance to, either agree to that or recommend changes also.
Okay, do I entertain a motion that we adopt this municipal order as read? Mr. Blank, Mrs. Reckers. Any other discussion? Okay. Matt, you want to do a voice vote on this one or just roll call because it's easier?
We don't need a voice, or we don't need a roll call.
All right, voice vote. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right, motion carried. All right, any announcements for today? Mr. Cahill?
Depending on how our meeting goes for the next committee meeting, I hopefully will have a presentation from the facility study. We do have some updates on that and some recommendations.
Any other announcements?
Yes. I had the Kenton County Alliance meeting today over the phone. It was a Zoom thing. And their concern now is with legislation and with the kids not going to school on a regular schedule anymore, that they're going to start getting into trouble and mischievous things. So they're going to try and do some programs to help that situation out some. End of report.
All right. Mrs. Reckers, did you have something to add?
I did. At the committee meeting, I'll also be presenting some enhancements to the Code of Ethics. It hasn't been updated since 1994, so I have some recommendations, and my goal is to have those changes redlined out to council next week, for review so that we can have it as a discussion item at the committee meeting.
Okie dokie. Anything else? All right, do I entertain a motion that we adjourn?
I make a motion, we adjourn.
Second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Say aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Motion carried. Have a good evening.